I acquired by slow degrees a knowledge of the people into the midst of which I had been exiled. I began to penetrate into its life and into its manner of thought, to find my way through the labyrinth of its party divisions, and to become familiar with its customs and manners. It was no light task, for the Jews are a people who close their life behind 7 seals, especially in the presence of a Roman functionary. Months passed, years, before I could prepare a substantial report for Pilate. It was enough for them to see the flash of my armor when I was about on official duty, or to catch a glimpse of my toga on other occasions, and they made themselves scarce as if I were the carrier of a pestilence. But by dint of patient effort, I made the acquaintance of individuals and accustomed them to my presence. I cannot say how it was, but this people which repelled me also had a curious attraction for me. It awakened my interest from the first moment of our meeting. My duties brought me into frequent contact with the higher officials of the temple, and I was a regular visitor in some of the more aristocratic homes in the upper city. I also contracted a number of friendships in the higher social circles. In particular, I was greatly obligated to the 2 youngest sons of the old high priest for their assistance in guiding my first steps among those strange and hostile crowds. I gathered a great deal of information, which was not without value to me in my official capacity. Apart from these personal contacts, I found much pleasure in circulating through the city and observing its life. I did not confine myself to the richer quarter of the palaces, but went down into the most miserable sections of the lower city and made the acquaintance of the Jewish masses. It was here that I found the marketplace, and here I could touch the pulse of the city. It was not, strictly speaking, a marketplace, but a long, wide street which cut a path from one end to the other of the old city. It contained most of the shops. Here the fishers of the Sea of Gennesaret and of Acco brought their goods, fresh and salted, for sale, and found ready and appreciative buyers among the Jerusalemites. Here the farmers of Sharon marketed their vegetables. There were varieties of greens and fruits such as are not to be seen elsewhere. The gardens about Jerusalem sent their honey-dripping figs, soft and rounded like full udders. Some of these gardens had grown fat on the blood of the sacrifices drained off from the temple. Hence their fruits were peculiarly rich and juicy. Such clusters of grapes as I saw in this market have not their equal anywhere else in the world. And along this street, under coverings of dried palm leaves, or in booths made up of sacks stretched on poles, or in niches under the columns of arcades, the artisans worked in the open. The dyers, the oil pressers, the weavers, the younger men among the weavers were a fierce, quarrelsome lot, and gave us endless trouble. The tailors, the sandal makers, who took foot measurements on the spot, but would never glance up at the faces of their women customers, most of the sandal makers were exceptionally pious, were here. So were the saddle makers and tent makers and perfume sellers. These last were generally regarded among the Jews as frivolous idlers, because, having to deal almost exclusively with women, they could easily be led astray. Along the street stood endless rows of oil cruisers and honey jars. There were countless skins of wines of every variety, from the local provincial wines of Sharon to the precious and costly wines of Cyprus. There was every grade of grain, including the famous wheat of Ephraim, thick-eared, heavy, and rich in flour. There were the far-famed dates of Jericho. Every man's trade could be recognized, even when he was not engaged at it. Dyers went about with colored threads drawn through the lobes of their ears. Tailors had needles stuck in their clothes. There were scribes without number. With goose quills behind their ears, they sat at every corner before little tables, selling their services and little parchment scrolls bearing excerpts from their sacred writings. They wore little leather boxes on arm and forehead, and these contained passages known as the Shema from their code of laws, which they taught the children to repeat by heart. For in every street of Jerusalem the Jews had their synagogues and study chapels, whither they brought their young to be instructed. If a mother went out to buy oil for her night lamp, the women had to provide this from their own earnings. She would not forget to procure at the same time a Shema or some other sacred parchment for her little ones. Often enough there would occur loud disputations between scribes and scholars, in the very midst of this clamour, as to the manner of writing a certain phrase, and almost as numerous as the scribes were the money changers. It was impossible to shake them off, for they were everywhere, with dinars dangling from their ears and jingling bags of coin in their hands. In and out of this tumultuous mass moved the tax collectors with the badges of their office on their breasts, and the temple officers with leather straps in their hands, taking in tithe and heave offering for the high priest. The officers addressed themselves to the peasants and gardeners, and if any countryman had failed to pay his dues to the temple, his produce was declared unclean and untouchable, and no purchaser dared come near. Every trade also had its own separate side street. In the street of the dyers one often came across precious purple stuffs from Tyre and Zidon, white sheep's wool from the Syrian and Lebanonian hills, and gorgeous silks of Persia. In the street of the spice dealers the air was laden with innumerable perfumes. There was no end to the variety of oils they used, from the coarser kind for softening the leather of their sandals to the costliest kind reserved for brides on the marriage day and for the embalming of corpses. They had scores of names for their oils. In the street of the goldsmiths one might come across masterpieces of artistic work from Mesopotamia, Alexandria, Antioch, or even one of the Greek islands. Nor was it a rare thing to encounter implements and weapons and stuffs, stone, fur, and hide, originating in the remotest provinces, Gaul and Britain and Spain. Jerusalem was a world city. The temple drew pilgrims from every part of the empire and beyond, and these brought with them the produce of their respective countries. It was amusing enough to wander about in this chaos of men and materials and color, but it would have been more so if it had not been for the restless and turbulent spirit which pervaded it. The life of the foreign visitors to Jerusalem was mirrored chiefly in the court of the Gentiles, which encircled the temple, and through which I had frequent occasion to pass. My personal quarters were, of course, in the Antonia, but our tax offices, military administration, quartermaster stores, and police precincts were scattered in the vast, formless buildings of the old Herodian palace, where the procurator lodged when he came to Jerusalem on the holy days. As a matter of fact, there was a shorter path through the new city between the Antonia and the palace. We had cut it through for strategic reasons, but I preferred to pass from one to the other via the outer court. Within the city, one might be surprised by the sight of a caravan of camels drawing in from a distant province and carrying on their proud humped backs rich gifts to the temple, while on the foremost of them sat swaying an outlandish figure in exotic garb. But within the temple courts there was a fascinating concentration of the spiritual life of the Jews. For apart from the sacrificial commerce in doves, fine flour, spices, and incense, apart from the chaffering of the money changers, one always encountered, either in the open between the pillars on sunny days, or in the shelter of the arcades and balconies on days of rain, the scholars and interpreters of the law, the preachers and visionaries and foretellers of the Messiah. The throngs they attracted consisted of all manners and conditions of men, the poor and the rich, workers in rough sackcloth garb and pilgrims in colored linens, all of them listening in pious silence. But they were at their most interesting on their Sabbath, that is, on that recurrent seventh day which they set aside for rest. I was never able to grasp the idea of their Sabbath. Imagine an entire people taking every seventh day in its life and turning it into a day of rest. The entire country comes to a standstill. There is no movement, no labor, no work of any kind, nothing to do but rest. They all rested, they, their wives, their children, and even their animals. For on that day nothing is done with the animals beyond leading them to drink at the wells or throwing some fodder into their troughs. At first I was under the impression that this seventh day of rest, or Sabbath, which as an institution is equally unknown among the civilized and the barbarian peoples, was nothing but a concession to laziness, a day of complete and pointless idleness. But I soon discovered that this was by no means the case. To begin with, whatever one might say of this extraordinary people, one accusation could not be brought against it, that of laziness. If anything, these Jews are a trifle too active. Had they only known how to be idle on occasion, had they only taken themselves and their work and their God and their temple a little less seriously, they would have spared themselves, us, and the rest of the world a good deal of trouble. They were, as a matter of fact, an exceptionally industrious people. The hard and niggardly soil which was their portion had taught them this lesson. They had to wring their livelihood from the rocks, and their God had not spoiled and corrupted them with an overabundance of gifts. It became evident that they had taken their Sabbath upon themselves, with all its duties, prescriptions, and prohibitions, not as a period of rest, but as a heavy burden. They did not dare to walk beyond a certain distance, lest they desecrate the sanctity of the Sabbath. This was not a day not of repose, but of sacred service, a day of self-giving and of self-sacrifice to their God. On that day they sundered themselves from this world. They went about as if they had been translated to another life, their eyes, hearts, and heads fixed on the heavens. On that day they belonged solely to their God. And yet they were by no means so alien to this worldly life, and such deniers of its worth, as the foregoing might imply. With all their somberness, they had quite a capacity for rejoicing. There were, first of all, their holy days. On one of these they brought their earliest ripened fruits to the temple. It was amusing to look down from the Antonia and watch the peasants of Sharon and Galilee, bowed with constant stooping over the soil, carrying their first fruits to the holy place. From what I hear, they choose the offerings, the dates, the pomegranates, the grapes, while they are still on the stalk. They go out into the fields, they observe what fruits are beginning to ripen, and they wrap them round with little twigs to mark them off. It was strange to see with what piety, what fanatical faith, they bore the baskets with their tributes to the dwelling place of their God. The delegations from the various districts and provinces arrived in separate formation, rich and poor from each locality marching together. First came an ox with a golden crown thrown over its horns. This was the sacrifice, whose steps were accompanied by the sound of music as they entered the city limits. Rich landowners and even members of the aristocracy carried their own offerings on their shoulders, in gold and silver-plated baskets. The poor bore their gifts in baskets of straw and twigs. The officers of the temple and the population of Jerusalem came forth from the city to receive them. The workers and artisans of Jerusalem lined the street and invited the pilgrims into their homes.